One of my favorite things about the Entity API is the supplied metadata wrappers, which we're going to be taking a look at in this lesson. The metadata wrappers allow us to wrap an entity object with another class and provides easier access to the values of all the fields and the properties. It makes it so that I don't have to worry about things like the current user's preferred language or field cardinality. I can just access the properties and their value using simple object notation. Rather than what you've probably seen before when you've tried to mess with a node object in Drupal, and it's a giant array where you have to address the field number, and then the language, and then the delta of the value in the field. We're going to see that it's much easier to get those values using metadata wrappers. We're also going to look at how you can set those values using a metadata wrapper, and then saving the entity back to the database. So let's look at some of the things we can do with metadata wrappers. For talking about metadata wrappers, I don't really have an extremely practical use case that goes along with the video entity that we've been creating, but I think that they're a really important concept to cover. And since, like with most things in the Entity API, the documentation can be a little bit spread out and hard to follow, I wanted to make sure that we did a couple of examples demonstrating the usage of metadata wrappers. If you want to read the documentation, a couple of good places to start are, of course, the handbook on Drupal.org, which has this page about entity metadata wrappers, which explains a little bit of what's going on, and also provides some examples. The other good place to look is in the README that comes with the entity module. If you take a look at your code, in the entity module from contrib, the readme.txt contains a pretty good explanation of entity metadata wrappers and gives a couple examples of their use case. Finally, in the includes directory, there's this entity.wrapper.inc file, which contains the entity metadata wrapper code that we'll be making use of. So, a couple of good places to look for documentation. In the entity demo module that we started out with in this series, I'm going to implement hook node view. I'll just add the code in for that. So I've got my implementation of hook node view, and I'm just going to use the DSM function from the devel module to print out our node object. If I go back to our site, and I navigate to a specific page, like this article here, I view the article, and I also see the node object echoed out at the top of the page. So where metadata wrappers really come into use when writing our code is accessing the value of the various fields and properties attached to our node object in this case, or it could be our video entity object. Whatever the case is, we're dealing with accessing the value of these things. Like, for example, the created property has this timestamp. This field underscore number field has its value. But you notice that accessing that value is a little difficult. You need to go node, field number, the language, and the delta, and then you can finally get down to the actual value. The code to do something like that in our module would look like this. I could do node, here we'll leave this at the top. I could print out the node field number. That key was und, like so, 0 value. And ultimately that gives me the numeric value of that field. This UND, however, should actually be the constant language none. So now I'm printing out the value of that field. If we refresh the page, you should see that. You can see that's the number 3352 is the value of it. This code is a little bit convoluted, and it doesn't take into account things like the fact that the user may be viewing the site with a different preferred language, if we had translated content and so forth. Metadata wrappers help to eliminate some of this complexity. Let's look at how I would get this same value using a metadata wrapper. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to make use of a function provided by the entity module. I'll just open this up real quick. We're going to use the entity metadata wrapper function. We call this, and what it'll do is return a new object that is a metadata wrapper around an entity of the specified type. Takes a couple of arguments, the type of entity, and some data to wrap. Let's take a look at how we would use this. So in our code, we could get a new wrapper for this node by doing the following. The entity type is node, and the data that we want to wrap is the node object itself. So now the same code using this entity metadata wrapper would look like this. Node wrapper, the field member method chained in the value method, which will do things like figure out the appropriate language, the fact that this is a single value field so that we don't need to worry about the delta and so forth, and simply return the value. Just to prove that it's working, I'm going to go back to our site and refresh. I see the same number printed out twice, once using the old method and once using the entity metadata wrapper method. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, but how do I know how to access the value of these and so forth? Again, a good place to look is the information contained in the README for the module. And this shows that we can do things like get the value, retrieve the value of a field. This also works for properties as well. And it's all inherited from that hook entity property info, which we talked about in the last lesson. That's how it knows how to do things like figure out what the value of this field is. This is a neat example. It shows that you can reference values of referenced entities as well. Let's say that I wanted to do something like figure out the email address of the user that submitted this node. And the standard method for that would be, I could look at the node object, find out that UID34 is the author of the node. So then I could use that information to use user underscore load the user entity, and then access the mail property from the user entity. Using metadata wrappers, this is much easier. I could do something like the following in my code. ESM, our node wrapper. I want information about the author, and I want to know the value of the mail field. What this is doing is this metadata wrapper was smart enough to know that the property named author on a node object is actually a reference to a user entity through the UID field. So it's loading that user entity, applying a metadata wrapper to that so that I can access the properties or fields of that user entity in the same way that I can access the properties and fields from our node entity. And we'll put this is email address of the author. To show that that's working, you can see the email address of the author is listed here. So now you can start to see how these metadata wrappers make it really easy to cut down on the amount of code that you need to write. They also make it easy because I don't need to know things like the fact that I would have used the user load function to retrieve this information. Doesn't matter what type of entity it is, the metadata wrapper will take care of wrapping it and pulling in the fields and properties as necessary. This system is somewhat hard to document though, because any entity can come along and add any number of fields or properties. So how do I find out what's available? Every element in a metadata wrapper has a getPropertyInfo method, all the way from the base to our base node property. And we could do this for each of the individual properties and fields as well. I'll look at the node wrapper's getPropertyInfo. Basically, this does some introspection onto our node entity to figure out what's there. It's the same data that we've seen in, for example, hook entity property info. So here's a list of all the properties and fields for this node entity. And if I take a look at each one, I can find out some more information about it, like the label, the type, and so forth. This tells me that I could do things like use the metadata wrapper to get at the values of each tag. I could, if I wanted to, get the UID, for example. This also shows that here, the author, which we just took a look at, which is of the type user, I can get more from that by using the chaining method and chaining multiple of these wrappers together and accessing the methods or properties on this user entity as well. What if I wanted to know more about what I could access on the author property? I might do something like this. Now we're saying the node wrappers author property, and I want information about that. We'll refresh. So here's the further information about that author property. It's also got a number field, the UID, name, we pulled out the email address. This is one way that you can start to figure out what information is available for each of these properties. So get property info is really powerful. Another one that I wanted to look at is iterating over fields that contain multiple values. In this case, the tags field on our article node can potentially contain multiple values. Just to confirm that, let's go edit our article. And you can see that we've got kittens, puppies, and corn chowder. So we've got 3 different terms on this article node. If I wanted to access the value of each of those, one way to do that using metadata wrappers is to use the getIterator method. In my code, I could do something like this. I could say for each node wrapper, we're going to look at our tags field. And for the tags field, I'm going to say get iterator as tag. And what this will do is using information defined in hook entity property info and how to deal with lists of tags, which are really term reference fields, it's going to allow me to loop over all of the values in this field tags field, assign each one individually to our tag variable, and tag here is actually going to be a metadata wrapper around the referenced term. And I can do something like tag property info. And when I refresh, I should see for all 3 of the tags, it's showing us the property information for those. I can get at things like the name of this tag, the term ID, and so forth. So I could access the name, for example, by doing tag name value. Refresh and demonstrate that. So there we go. We've got our 3 different tag names. So that's really cool. Again, a really easy way to access that information. Another one of my favorite things about metadata wrappers is that they provide a consistent way to access some of the information on entities. Here's a scenario. Every entity in Drupal has some properties that are the same. For example, every entity has a unique ID, but the property that contains that unique ID may be different. Nodes have an NID, users have a UID, our video entity has a ID property. Labels are another thing. Every entity in Drupal has to have a human readable label of some form or another. The property that contains it, though, can be different. Nodes have the title property. Users have the name property. Tags have a name property. The entity metadata wrapper provides a consistent way to get at those pieces of information. For example, I could do something like access the label of a node, like so, by just calling the label method. I could also change this up here from name value to just label and get at the same information. I go back over and refresh. You'll see I'm still getting our tag names printed out, or the label, and I'm getting our node title printed out. This is nice because it helps deal with the scenario when you're, for example, handed an entity of maybe an unknown type, or you don't know which field or property on that entity is the label or is the unique ID. Finally, in addition to using metadata wrappers to access the values of all these fields, I can also use metadata wrappers to set and save the value of these fields. For example, if I wanted to change the value of this number field to something else, I could use our entity wrapper around the node, field number, instead of value, I'm going to say set, and we'll just set it to 42, like so. And then I need to just call the save method on our node wrapper. Now when I refresh the page, it's going to update the value of that field to 42. first time it won't, because it just displayed that information and then we set it right after. The second time though, you can see it set that value to 42. So it also, in addition to providing methods for getting the value, it's also got setters for all of the values as well. Combine all these things together, and it makes some really unique ways that we can quickly get at the value of fields without having to use constructs like this: field number, some inferred language code, understanding what this delta is, and then the value here. And the value key could even be different depending on the field type. Image fields, for example, don't even have a value key. They have keys like FID and so forth. All of that information can be easily accessed using metadata wrappers. I recommend you take a look at wrapping just a standard node on your site using one of these entity metadata wrappers. So again, calling the entity metadata wrapper function, the entity type, and then the entity that you would like to wrap, and see what you can do. Also take a look at doing it with users. You could also do some neat things with our video entity as well. This is one of those things that you kind of have to play around with a little bit to really understand how it works. But once you grasp the concepts, it's a really, really powerful tool.